Thank you for coming. My talk will be next. This is regularization or lexical probability matching, how German speakers generalize plural morphology. And this is work done by me, Kate McCurdy, with my supervisors, Sharon Goldwater and Adam Lopez at the University of Edinburgh. So here we're going to be interested in how speakers handle variation in their input, and artificial language learning studies have given us a lot of information about this in recent decades. So we'll look at this through the lens of a hypothetical artificial language learning experiment. So let's imagine we have some training vocabulary for speakers where on the left is the set of nouns in the singular, and then on the right-hand column we have the set of nouns in their plural inflected form. And so an artificial language learning study might train participants on this sort of vocabulary and then give them a series of novel items at test time and ask them to produce the plural form to see how they generalize. So we can consider different patterns of behavior exemplified by three hypothetical speakers. So perhaps speaker A notices that about 2/3 of the training input nouns take S as the plural form and decides to simply consistently generalize this to all of the test items. So this would be an example of regularization. So overall variation in the input distribution has been reduced and to basically nothing. On the other hand, a hypothetical speaker B might instead apply S to 2/3 of the test items, and this we would consider to be a probability matching, right? Because they have maintained the statistics of the input distribution in their output. And now my understanding from the regularization literature is that we generally think that adults will behave more like speaker B in probability match, but under some conditions, some experimental conditions, which I believe the field is still sort of trying to figure out, they will behave like A and regularize, and this is an open question. And you can also imagine now if we add an extra dimension, a third type of behavior. So imagine now that our training vocabulary inputs also included two different sorts of articles, so noun classes expressed in the determiner on the singular and noun form of the noun, and that this is also available in test. So now we can imagine a hypothetical speaker C who notices that every noun that takes the L article in the singular takes S in the plural, and most nouns that take the Z article in the singular do not, and then generalizes this consistently to the test items. So this would be a third sort of behavior. This speaker we might consider to be regularizing conditional variation because they're taking a cue that is probabilistic in the input and making it perfectly predictive in the output. And this last form, I think, has been relatively less studied in the literature, so we were not really sure the extent to which children or adults do this. And so here we can also see the general setup of an artificial language learning experiment. We have some reference distribution, which is the training vocabulary, which we have full control over in these experiments. And then given some test items, we have some way of measuring the regularization behavior, and there's different ways to do this. So as it turns out, if we want to do here is see if we can take this framework and use it in a more natural language setting. And happily, it turns out that there is a natural language that shares many important characteristics with the hypothetical language I've shown you here, which happens to be German. So in German, each noun in the singular has a grammatical gender, which is either masculine, feminine, or neuter, which is expressed by the article preceding the noun in the singular. And there is also a variety of forms that the plural can take, which we will look at only very simplified. So we will consider only the most frequent classes here. So a couple of notes about how people think grammatical gender works in German. This is a plot showing the distribution of plural classes indicated by color. So blue means it takes an E suffix in the plural, purple means it takes an N, and yellow means it takes some other, this is grouping together some smaller suffixes, which have also been the subject of a lot of debate in the literature, and I'm happy to talk about them offline, but we're only going to focus on E and N. And as you can see from the y-axis here, so the three different groups, there's a pretty strong connection with gender, right? So grammatical gender of a noun is not a perfect cue to its plural class, but statistically it's a very, very correlated one. In particular, over 90% of feminine nouns take the purple N plural, right? So this is a very reliable cue. Linguists have noticed this, and it has gone into a lot of reasoning about this. And also, unsurprisingly, given these statistics, if you train a neural network model on this task, it will learn very quickly that gender is a very important predictor of plural class. And there's also some psycholinguistic evidence that speakers use grammatical gender in real-time comprehension, so in tasks like visual world eye tracking or in lexical decisions. However, if you take the kind of equivalent to the artificial language learning production task, which would be to give speakers novel words and ask them to inflect them, so a WUG task, basically, here the connection is a bit less clear. So if we take, for example, these three novel nouns, they happen to be drawn from the same set of stimuli that all three studies here used. Some studies found reliable effects of grammatical gender and plural inflection, and others did not. So this is a little bit puzzling. So our hope here is to take the regularization lens of looking at this and see if it sheds some light and the relationship here between how grammatical gender is or isn't used by speakers. And so a set of thinking here is that speakers may have a sense of the distribution over plural classes, which is appropriate for these novel nouns, but there is also actually a kind of natural distribution over grammatical gender, which the experiment might conflict with. So our thinking here was to actually try to elicit both distributions from speakers and see if they're using it when you give them full control over producing the joint distribution of these two classes. So, okay, so we've got the basic framework. We want to use this setup. We have our reference distribution, which is, again, the lexicon of German as a whole. However, because this is not an artificial language learning experiment and we don't have perfect control, we can't be sure that this is really the appropriate distribution. In particular, there's a lot of other confounds in the lexicon that could act on both of these classes. Sort of phonology can predict both, derivational morphology can affect them. So we might also want to look at the class of words that are similar to our stimuli, which are specifically selected to be monosyllabic and hence have fewer of these confounds. So we can also consider a second hypothetical reference distribution where we take only the monosyllabic nouns out of the lexicon. And as you can see, they're a sort of different distribution. So these are our two, and we're using these to kind of stand in for the training input, right? These are approximations. Like we don't know exactly what a German speaker will be exposed to, but these are two possible ways of approximating the relevant input for our distribution that we want to see how they generalize. And so now that we have them, we have now the all nouns as the top distribution in red and the monosyllabic and the lower one. And now what we want to do is figure out our measure of how we're going to assess regularization. So we're going to follow Ferdinand et al. In 2019 in framing this in terms of entropy reduction. So we can first calculate the entropy of our reference distributions. So here we can look at grammatical gender. In this plot, the red dot, gives the observed entropy metric for the lexicon as a whole. And the line is a confidence interval, which we get from simulating different draws from a similar distribution, following also the approach from Ferdinand et al. And we have the same thing for the monosyllabic set of nouns. So we have now these are our reference metrics for entropy for grammatical gender, and we can do the same thing for plural class. And then putting this in terms of experimental predictions, we can look at the entropy of the distributions that speakers produce, and if they fall within these confidence intervals, then we might say that they are consistent with probability matching one of these distributions. However, if they produce a distribution that is more consistent than either of these, then we might want to describe this behavior as regularization, and that would be lower on that metric. And so those are the two measures of overall variation that speakers could produce or could operate on. But we could also imagine the third behavior where they use grammatical gender in a very predictive way. So for that, we'll measure the mutual information between plural class and grammatical gender in each of these distributions. And here, mutual information kind of goes the other way. So higher means there's a stronger statistical relationship. So once again, we have confidence intervals there. If we see most speakers being within those confidence intervals, we can consider this consistent with probability matching behavior. Whereas if they're higher, then we'll say that they're doing conditional regularization. They're making these two classes more predictive of each other than they are in the observed lexical distribution. So this gives us our basic research question. So given this set of novel nouns in this framework, will German speakers regularize overall variation on one of these dimensions, regularize conditional variation by making these two dimensions more predictive of each other, or will they probability match one of the lexical distributions that we've set? So to get this data, we did an experiment. We recruited German speakers, 120 German speakers on Prolific, and we gave them this task. So we took the set of monosyllabic nouns and asked them to both, on the one hand, assign what they thought was the most likely gender for the noun by giving the article for the singular, and then also type out the inflected plural form. So here they have control over both of these distributions, and we want to see what they do with this. This is using the same set of 24 monosyllabic nouns that earlier studies have used, where they found mixed results on gender. And so we basically just take the distribution over those 24 nouns and use this to compute these entropy metrics for each speaker. And so now we will move to the results. So here we have, again, our reference distributions. Red top is the whole lexicon. Green bottom is the only monosyllabic nouns. So first of all, we can see what our speakers are doing overall. It's a little ambiguous. So let's look at looking at our direct hypotheses. First question is, if we look, do they regularize overall variation in either gender or plural class? So for gender, this is a box plot, and you can see that the majority of the speakers appear to produce a distribution over gender that is actually pretty consistent with both of the reference distributions. And when we look at plural class, it's a little bit different. So here, they seem to produce less variation than we see in the lexicon as a whole, but an amount that's roughly consistent with what we see for the set of kind of phonologically similar monosyllabic nouns. So this we might briefly summarize as likely to be probability matching, and with some more consistent evidence in favor of probability matching the monosyllabic set of nouns. So our second question is, do they regularize on conditional variation? So do they use grammatical gender in informing their plural class inflections? So for this, the answer is basically not very much. So they use grammatical gender very little, although an amount that is consistent with the monosyllabic distribution where gender is less predictive. So we might again consider this to be probability matching, but this is also a fairly surprising result because in the lexicon as a whole, gender is much more informative, and it seems like this would be something that speakers could use, right? This is a statistical relationship that is not hidden, and it's one that models pick up on very, very readily. So this is a slightly confusing or surprising finding. And so to emphasize that they really are not using gender to the extent that they could, we can look at a slightly more complicated visualization of this, but if you bear with me. So on the x-axis, this is the entropy over plural class variation, and each black dot is a speaker. So on the left-hand side, we have 0. These are speakers who only produced one plural class for all of the stimuli in the experiment. And then on the right-hand side, we have speakers who produced a range of plural classes. And the y-axis is how much gender influenced that plural class distribution, right? So the black line is the hypothetical maximum amount. That would be perfect conditioning on gender. And then the red and green boxes once again show the confidence intervals around the two reference distributions. So we can first see that most of the speaker black dots are in the green box, again, which is roughly consistent with probability matching to the monosyllable distribution. But I would like to draw your attention to this part. So these are speakers who are producing a level of variation in plural class similar to what we see in the overall lexicon, right? So they're using a lot of the classes, and they could, if they were following the amount of predictability of grammatical gender in the lexicon, then they would be more in the red box, right? But they are consistently below it. So even when on one dimension they're more similar to what we'd see in the lexicon as a whole, they're still not using gender as much as they could. Nowhere near as much as, say, a neural network would like them to. So this is pretty much the main takeaway. And I would like to leave us with these 2 points. So one is methodological. We can take this framework of regularization and use it, apply it to natural language to try to get some insights about what is going on. And the second main finding is that adult German speakers appear to be probability matching in terms of plural generalization in production, and they, in particular, they really don't seem to make the expected use of grammatical gender. So it's something like the predictability of the relationship between gender and plural class is maybe modulated by reference to phonologically similar nouns, or something is going on. But yeah, it's unexpected, and this framework helps us see a little bit better, perhaps, what might be going on there. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Hi, super interesting. But I don't understand this last point. They do not make expected use of grammatical gender, because it seems like they do exactly what they should be doing, given that it's monosyllabic nouns, right?
Right. I think this is it's expected in one way of looking at it and not in another. So it can be read in one way as matching to as matching to the level of informativity of a cue within that set of nouns. But it's also it's not entirely clear that the phonological class of nouns should take priority, right, over another very salient cue such as gender, right? It's not clear, necessarily obvious that should be the mediating factor, especially because there are some predictable phonological relationships, but not within the monosyllables, right? It's something more abstract. It's like the class of CBC nouns, and it's not really clear why that class abstractly should be more important in mediating the informativity of other cues like gender. So it's surprising in one way of looking at it and not in another.
And I have another question if there's time.
There's a question online.
Oh, there's a question online? Okay, I logged out of Zoom for my own thing. So would someone mind reading the online question?
Yes, there is an online question. So it's from the Vera Kempe, saying that great study. I assume these were artificial nouns, if I understood correctly. How much agreement was there in their gender judgments? Might weak representations of gender be the culprit?
Right. That is a good question, which I will really quickly answer by giving you, this is the distribution over each item. So here for each item, you can see the column, by breaking out by column, how many speakers assigned each gender to each noun. And one thing you can see is that I think it's a good point to bring up, there can be a lot of differences in opinion of the gender. And I think what this plot shows at a glance is that there was a lot of variation there, and then there was also independently a lot of variation in how people thought that should relate to plural class. Great, and I think that's time, so thanks for everybody who asked questions, and we'll welcome our next speaker.